I am going to introduce our speakers today. Up at the top there, you've got Dr. Kim Sundling. She's a board-certified psychiatric pharmacist with both direct and indirect clinical care experience. She's the behavioral health clinical pharmacist at Florida Blue. And below, you've got Debbie Del Rosario. She's a licensed clinical social worker with 25 years of clinical experience in direct and managed care environments. She's the director of behavioral health clinical programs at Florida Blue. So I want to welcome everyone to our webinar on post-traumatic stress disorder, resilience, and post-pandemic growth. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kim.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here and to learn more about mental health. We really appreciate you being here, and hopefully as we go, you will be able to learn and understand this topic more. So today we will be discuss responses to traumatic stress with an emphasis on post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, resilience, and post-pandemic growth. This webinar will review factors that have been associated with resiliency and growth. It will also highlight there is a science to mastering life's greatest challenges. You can learn to become more resilient, and growth is possible even in the context of pain, suffering, and post-pandemic stress. Please note that we will do our best today to avoid triggering conversations, but some of the information may be triggering to you. This webinar is not tailored medical advice, and any changes to your treatment plan must be talked to with your provider. After this, like Patty said, we will have a live Q&A. So with that, I thought it would be good for us to first kind of say something that we really focus on in Florida Blue as a behavioral health team for our members and for our staff. So what we would really like for you to remember and just kind of be the bread and butter of what you think of is that there is no health without mental health. That means that we cannot treat a whole person without thinking about mental health. In order for someone to recover and to improve their life circumstances, we need to think about the person as a whole person. And I am on the behavioral health team along with Debbie, and we have other people as well. But you'll be hearing from Debbie and I. But one of our big visions as a behavioral health team, and we really want you to understand this, is that we are here to ensure our members have the opportunity to achieve their best level of mental and physical health, and that our enterprise initiatives serve to promote behavioral health in our employees, members, and the residents of the communities served by GuideWell and Florida Blue. And that's something that we take very seriously and we work on every day. So today, kind of what we'll be talking about is really, what is well-being? I know that's a term that I've discussed in some other webinars if you were here last month, but it's good to get a refresher just in case you forgot. Then we're going to talk about types of trauma without really going into like super specific details, the impact of trauma, COVID-19 trauma, and then treatment and recovery. So first, like I said, we will be talking about mental well-being. So what is mental well-being? What does that mean? So mental well-being is an overall positive and hopeful emotional state fueled by a sense of purpose and satisfaction with life, work, and relationships. It is supported by the capacity to adapt to life stressors. So that's kind of a complicated definition, but hopefully by talking a little bit more about what impacts it, you'll kind of understand. So there's a ton of things that really can impact it, but there are just a few up here on the screen that you can see now. So biological factors, such as family history or changes in your body chemistry. One really good example is for women after delivering a baby. Sometimes the hormone shifts and chemical shifts can cause some women who suffer from postpartum depression, and there's other things like postpartum psychosis and things like that. So those changes really can impact a mother's well-being. There's also life experiences, such as trauma and loss, which we'll really be talking about later today. And typical day-to-day events that can just make us kind of feel blue. And it's completely normal to have these days where you just kind of feel blue, especially after like a really big life event, like a wedding or the birth of a baby or a death of someone or a loved one. These can really cause us to feel blue sometimes after we crash. I know when I was a pharmacy student, I always tended to crash after finals week because it was just go, go, go. And I would sometimes feel blue after that just because my body was like, I need rest, I need to sleep. And just another important point is that mental well-being really changes over time. It changes as the demand placed on a person change. Mental well-being is negatively affected when the demands exceed the person's resources and coping abilities. So a really good example of that is when the pandemic first hit and everyone was having to adjust, well, if you were a parent, having to adjust to your kids being home, you working from home, some people lost their jobs. So it can really vary person to person, but just know that these can change as we age as well. Sometimes when we are older, we're able to cope with things that maybe our younger selves couldn't, but then there's other things that come up just with aging. And just understand that all of these things, it's very person specific. So just because something impacts my well-being, it might not impact yours. And that's really a message that we like to hone in on in the mental health world, is treating you as an individual, because no one is alike, and that's a really good thing. So well-being, I told you a little bit about what it is, things that impact it, and how it changes over time. So how do we monitor this? How do we monitor this day to day for ourselves? You can see on the slide here that there's a lot of different things that really can impact our mental well-being and just what we should really be monitoring. So the first two really kind of probably make pretty good sense. You could probably guess these things. But happiness and satisfaction. And this doesn't mean that you have to be happy all the time, because no one's happy all the time. We have a range of emotions. I mean, just think of a toddler, the range of emotions they have in 10 minutes. It can sometimes be a significant amount. So what this is meaning is, what is your general average day feeling? How satisfied are you with your job? How satisfied are you with your marriage, your life, and things like that? And then mental and physical health, they go really hand in hand. So if your mental health is not well, it's likely that your physical health is not well. And if your physical health is not well, sometimes your mental health is not well, because they all interact in a way. So if you are overall in good health of both of these things, your well-being is better just because you're in a better state of mind. And the third one there, the meaning and purpose, might not be as intuitive, but it's shown in studies that when someone has meaning or purpose to their life, they often are more satisfied and happy and content with their life. So this doesn't mean that, you need to be in a job that you absolutely love or anything like that, although it can help. But this could be as simple as, finding joy in volunteering at a food shelter, or going to an animal or humane shelter and petting the dogs, or whatever you can do there. So this is just kind of finding something that really gives you that purpose. And sometimes that can even just be being a parent is very meaningful and purposeful for you. It really depends on your trajectory and your goals. And then patience and resiliency. That is definitely important. Patience and resiliency, that kind of refers to your ability to adapt to challenging events in your life and learning from them. So kind of building from those hard times in your life. And we'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation as well. Satisfaction with relationships. You guys can probably guess why this is important, but if you're in a hard relationship or you're estranged with your partner or kids or siblings or mom and dad, any of those things, it can really impact how we feel because for instance, for me, if I am in conflict with like my friends or my husband, it really affects my like day-to-day life, and it's really hard for me to focus on work because I just am thinking about that. So overall, it makes me feel very poor about my life situation. And then lastly, this one is obviously very important, but economic and personal security. So where you are financially and things like that. Are you at risk for losing your job? Are you having to live paycheck to paycheck? Is it really stressful for you? That can really impact your mental well-being. So all of these things are very important. And if you are feeling like maybe you're not doing so well, sometimes looking at these factors and improving them really can help you feel better overall. So with that being said, I kind of want to flip gears and think a little bit more about prolonged stress. And I think all of us have probably been feeling this a little bit with the pandemic. I know I have, and I know other people, friends of mine and family have also felt this way. So stress is very subjective. I will say that first. So there's some things that are going to stress me out, but then it might not stress out Debbie. So we are all different people. So sometimes people handle things differently, and sometimes the person is the complete opposite. But studies have shown time and time again, if someone is under prolonged stress that they perceive as stress, things can go a little wonky in your body, such as what's up here. This is a short list, but there are hundreds of things that stress does. And that's why it's so important, if you can, to really help combat that stress if you can, because over time it can lead to these things. And some of these things can be permanent issues if we do not take care of it. So this one probably kind of makes sense to you, the anxiety and depression. Those sometimes can feel like stress. Some of the symptoms of those two things can, but the longer we're stressed, the more likely we are to have an anxiety disorder or develop depressive disorder. Sleep problems, I think all of us have probably experienced this at night where your mind is just like all over the place, or you have a big presentation like this and you can't sleep at night because you're just thinking about it. So stress, doing that on your sleep can really harm just your overall well-being in life, because sleep is super important and every person requires a different amount of sleep. But it is shown if you do not get enough sleep, a lot of things can go wrong in your physical and mental health. So sleep is super important. The other thing prolonged stress can do is cause weight gain. And I will say sometimes in other people it can cause the flip side of it, but for the most part it causes weight gain because it increases your chemical called cortisol in your body, and that causes you to hold on to body weight. So that's why sometimes with prolonged stress you gain weight. It's directly related to cortisol. And in addition to that, sometimes when people are stressed, they stress eat is kind of the non-medical way of saying it. But I know sometimes when I get really stressed, then I just want to eat all the chocolate or ice cream or chips. So definitely prolonged stress can cause weight gain. It also can cause digestive problems. And this can be a wide array of things. It can be, upset stomach, nausea, can be diarrhea, or even constipation. And it's actually related to serotonin, which serotonin is your happy chemical. That's what I like to call it. And when we're stressed, that goes, it just goes like out of control in our body. And you have a bunch of serotonin receptors in your gut and stomach. So when you have too much serotonin going on, it makes you want to go to the bathroom, or it can cause you to be constipated. It really depends person to person, but that is why prolonged stress can really lead to digestive problems. These last two, the memory and concentration impairment, A lot of times stress can really inhibit our ability to think. That's why sometimes when people are public speaking, they just they can't think of words, or they completely lost their train of thought. And that's why prolonged stress can cause that in that situation. And then long term, it's just doing that all the time. And the last one here, prolonged stress is really bad for your heart. As you guys can probably guess, or maybe you know someone that has suffered from these things, but it's really shown that prolonged stress can cause heart disease, heart attack, high blood pressure, and even stroke. So with that being said, I would love for you to take away that, stress and just really any type of mental health issue can really lead to some of these problems. And stress, especially long-term, can really cause a lot of physical and mental harm. So kind of moving into PTSD, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder, there are two types of trauma that I want to cover first. So there's a single event, which is just one event that happened. It typically, is one instance, like one day, 1 hour, something like that. And then on the flip side, there is complex or ongoing trauma, which we call type 2. And an example of that is actually COVID-19. And you can see on the screen there, it says unpredictable, invisible, sustained, long trauma. So COVID-19 definitely is categorized under that. And as you'll see when we talk in the next couple of slides, you'll understand kind of why the pandemic has been really hard on most of us. So I want to get really nerdy with you here first before I pass it over to Debbie. I really love to help people understand why things happened. As a pharmacist, this stuff is just really fascinating to me because when we discover medicine, it's because we understand the pathophysiology. So if we know that something is stimulated by this, we can give you a medicine that sits in there and blocks it from happening. So that's really why I love for you guys to understand the pathophysiology of trauma and PTSD, because I think it will help you better understand that this is something that you can't necessarily have control of. It's just your body's natural reaction to this, and that there is actual physiological changes that occur when you experience trauma, and also just in PTSD. So the brain is a very complicated organ. It is a very complex but very important, as you guys can imagine, for our bodies. So when you experience trauma or you have PTSD, there's lots of things that change. And I tried to narrow it down to 3 simple things. So there's hormonal changes, which is primarily what I talked about when we were talking about stress and how it can cause weight gain. So hormonal changes that happened is there's prolonged high cortisol, which is stress, your stress hormone, and ghrelin, which is the thing that makes you hungry. That's why to my husband, I'm always like, I'm turning into a gremlin. So ghrelin means hungry. It's your hungry hormone. This creates greater reactivity to stress. So long-term damage to cells, structures of the body, and other hormone glands. So this, in the long term, really can impact how you react to stress. It's why if someone has PTSD or you just recently went through a trauma, you are quicker to stress than you may have previously been. So something bothers you more easily than it did in the past. There's also neural pathways and brain architecture changes. So it actually causes rewiring of our nerve pathways of thought, patterns, and habits of the mind. And what that means is that what normally would, be signaling going along on the nerve pathway in your brain, it gets detoured to somewhere else. So you don't react to things like you normally would because all these pathways are going different ways. It's kind of like when you have construction going on and you have to go a different way. That's basically what happens with your brain. Along with that, shrinkage of the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of, I like to think of it as your brakes system. It kind of helps you regulate your emotions. And on the screen there, it is I think it's pink or salmon. We'll call it salmon. That is your prefrontal cortex. And then the corpus callosum. This is how the two brains communicate. So you have two sides of your brain, and there's like this little thing that goes in between them. And that's how they talk to each other. That's how you can walk, because your two brains are in constant communication. So that's shrink along with the prefrontal cortex. And then lastly is the hippocampus, and this is for your learning and memory storage. And that is kind of what shrinks from trauma and PTSD. And then the amygdala, which is the red dot there on your screen, that actually enlarges, causing it to be more reactive. So your amygdala, think of it as your alarm system. So like if you're suddenly in the forest and there's a bear, your amygdala is just going bananas. It's like you need to run. So the amygdala, if it's enlarged and more reactive, you're going to respond to stress or like loud noises very abruptly and just much more responsive than you would have before this happened. And then the last thing are the nervous system changes. The sympathetic nervous system becomes supercharged, and what we call that in medicine is your fight or flight. So that is also the system that is responsive. Again, if you saw a bear, this nervous system is going like, you need to get out of here, and it really heightens your reaction. The parasympathetic nervous system, that's what's responsible for rest and digestion. And what happens is it is not as engaged, so it's harder for you to relax. So you can see that PTSD is extremely complicated, and it changes a bunch of things that happen. And trauma alone can cause this, but then over time, long-term trauma can kind of form into PTSD, and Debbie will talk more about that. But this is just a good overview of the impact of trauma, because I want you to understand that, yes, there's a mental aspect to it, but there's also a really big physical reaction. So going back to the nervous system changes, just a couple more things that I want to talk about is with your nervous system. Because the sympathetic nervous system is so much more supercharged, that causes symptoms of anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance in patients that struggle with PTSD. And on the flip side, the parasympathetic nervous system, because that is not as engaged, that can cause immobility, depression, apathy, and fatigue. So I just like you to understand why these symptoms happen, because for me, it helps me understand like, oh, this is what's going on with me. There's an actual change in your brain and just your body in general that is causing these symptoms to happen. So the last thing before I pass it over to my colleague, Debbie, is I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, because as you can see, stress and trauma really can impact you. But living in this constant hypervigilant state, and what hypervigilance means, in case you're not familiar with that term, I know I wasn't before I was in school, is it's just this constantly looking out for threats or constantly being on alert for something to happen. So being in that state of mind really takes a toll on us as a person, but also as a community. People's emotions are just higher. People are more likely to get snappy with people. You're not sleeping as well. And it's not just adults, it's kids too. It's like everyone in the world has been going through this prolonged trauma. So there's a lot of impact to that. And with that being said, I'm going to pass the baton over to Debbie, and she'll talk a little bit more about kind of resiliency and just characteristics of COVID trauma.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. As Kim was talking about, that COVID trauma has been very impactful. We've gone through a lot with our stress. And just some of the characteristics of what we've been seeing lately is regarding kind of what's indicated on here. This was very sudden and completely unexpected that everything kind of shut down and the world kind of stopped
for a period of time. We were removed from individuals, our loved ones, from a number of different ways, whether we could not even be next to them or being able to have normal conversations or interactions as we used to. There was physical isolations. We had loss of social contact where people maybe have moved from a work setting and now we're only in a home setting. So, and that's not only for work, but also from education for our kids as well. Were removed from their friends as everybody was moved to that at-home setting. There was loss of routines. We were no longer able to do our normal ways of coping with changes or stress in our life. It may have been going to a nice restaurant or may have gone to a concert. Things along those lines were no longer able to be something that we could rely on to help us move forward in dealing with that stress. For some, there was a loss of income and livelihood. Again, if it was your lifestyle was working in a service industry, those services were no longer able to be facilitated, So a number of people lost their jobs, companies downsized, and there was some significant impact to income and livelihood. There was disorientation of the experience. No one knew what this was. No one knew what we were supposed to be expecting next. Had no way of gauging we used to do this in the past. No one knew. And it was truly figuring out kind of collectively, how are we going to get through this trauma, kind of living moment by moment to figure out what was that next thing we can do to help. And it wasn't just a short period of time. I mean, I feel like we're still going through these components even now. Even with the vaccines in place and booster shots, there are still components that is listed in there that is showing that we are still going through this because our life has not gone back to where it was back in 2020. We've talked a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder, but this new term has come into play specifically at this time called post-pandemic stress disorder. So it's very similar in many capacities as post-traumatic stress disorder, with the difference being it's more characterized from a mood perspective. So anxiety and mood instability is indicated, and I think it's more of a mental exhaustion at this point. It's really interfering with our quality of life and not being able to move forward in the ways we used to. Everybody is going through things differently. It varies person by person, but some of the things that's listed here is that there has been an increase in anxiety. We have feelings of hopelessness, low motivations, where you used to maybe think that I will go out and experience things. You're like, what's the point of going at this particular time? Feeling some out of control as the world outside is impacting and you're not able to do anything about it. So that has caused some disruptions and not knowing how to address it. There's been disrupted sleep, which is a common impact of anybody dealing with stress. We've talked about that increase or decrease, kind of the two extremes of your appetite if you're going to overeat to address, trying to coping with what was going on, or you may be so upset that you don't feel like eating at all and losing weight. Feeling numb, that, not knowing which direction to go to next. Withdrawing from social situations. I've seen a number of individuals who used to go out to hang out with other people, would go to going out to eat, going to visit friends, traveling. Things like that have been reduced because of the concerns of illness or sickness, or if they are taking care of others in their family that may have an illness, they don't want to give them COVID. So there's concerns about withdrawing from social situations. When you're dealing with change, there's obviously some times that you easily become agitated. That this is not the life that you want. You're losing that control. So some ways of acting out is just becoming angry at anything that is happening. And then that catastrophic thinking, spiraling down into that downward spiral that, this is only going to get worse. Because again, we don't have any precipitation of where things are going or what's happening next. When we're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, and we were talking a little bit about the post-pandemic, a lot of individuals experience these components. They have similar behaviors that are very much listed on this particular slide. They may be avoiding places, like we were mentioning about with the COVID individuals. They avoid activities. They're avoiding places, maybe withdrawing, losing interest in things, of what's the point of going through there. There is a number of individuals who are also going through using non-productive coping mechanisms, such as substance use, to try to avoid what's going on. So these compound on there. There's negative thinking that a lot of times impacts that individual and how they are looking at their world, looking at that impacts their mood. They are instantly on guard, become disruptive. And with these negative thoughts, again, it's that downward spiral that a lot of people will go through, sleeping difficulties, they have bad nightmares. But really, as we were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, anyone dealing with traumas could be going through any of these cycles or components of it, and we just want to let individuals know that they have had that opportunity to have resources and success. So with one of the approaches that we are looking at and are being thankful for is to change the way you're looking at trauma, is looking at it from a different perspective. One of the common treatment modalities that is utilized for individuals is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that therapy is one where you're changing the thought process or how you are looking at things. And very similarly here in the post-pandemic approach, a way to recovery is looking at it more in a positive capacity. Strength-based approach. How can we overcome those negative time things? We are looking at being more positive, looking for psychological changes as a result of struggling with those traumas. So looking at the positive way of looking at things, trying to remove yourself from some of those negative spirals that may be occurring and dealing with those otherwise highly challenging. And as it's indicated here, is that we've all survived 100% of our worst days. Everything will be all right. We've got to move forward and continue thinking about the growth and a positive next steps that is going to be happening for us. When we're looking at resiliency, this is a common term I think we have used time and time again, but it really is the way of how can we identify moving forward in these adverse times. How do we process adapting? A lot of times I think we've used terms such as, well, someone's just, got the grit. They're just able to overcome that. And that's not necessarily what it is. What we're doing is we're managing the stress and wanting to find ways of thriving through it, not just surviving. So looking in the face of adversity, looking through our trauma, our tragedy, threats, or any of those stresses that we're going from, not just COVID, but, stresses in family, relationships, any of serious health issues or workplace or financial stressors. When any of those are out of alignment, we need to figure out ways to bounce back or to return it to a more steady state. And that's where that resiliency is. How are you going to be able to move through this? And being able to do that, because unfortunately stress is not going to go away, it's going to continue on, and we need to find ways of returning back to that steady state so that we're not only getting through it and not just surviving through it, but like it says, thriving through that moment. We are building our members to, definitely want to find ways that we can help support resiliency, looking at ways of flourishing. It is a difficult time to working through this. We are helping individuals. We want them to realize that there is ways of improving stress. There is a number of digital resources that are out there, components that will be able to facilitate that, because we need to figure out ways to improve our emotional awareness. We are also doing some flourishing opportunities, which is how we are addressing those different components of our lives. And we're excited to be partnering with a number of our providers in our communities to continue that discussions and actually talking to individuals, identifying areas of their life, seeing how they are doing, how would they gauge their life, and how they are approaching things from an overall well-being approach. Because that is, again, we want people to flourish through these times as we're moving towards that next step. A key component of understanding and focusing on resilience is looking at our core components, looking at how do we take care of ourselves first, and how, because if we don't take care of ourselves, there's really nothing left for anyone else. I think we've heard the term related to if individuals are on a plane, make sure that you put the mask on yourself for any loved ones around you, because you do need to make sure that you're able to handle what's coming, and then you can help others. So when we look at core resiliencies, looking at ways of dealing with our emotional control, things can become very quickly overwhelming. We've seen toddlers who become very emotional very quickly, and it takes moments to figure out how to bring that into a more purposeful conversations, being able to control our emotions, because, a lot of times people just, won't react, and you'll be coming up with more resistance than finding people who will help you through things. Being more mindful of where our thoughts are, of where our ideas are. Again, trying to keep them on a more positive approach is a core component that builds up that resiliency. If we keep thinking things negatively, that self-fulfilling prophecy occurs. You continue to spiral down into that negative situations that you're saying. If you think that you're not going to be able to do it, you're already halfway there because you don't think you're able to accomplish it. We definitely need to make sure we're doing self-care components, focusing on our own engagement and purpose, looking at ways of solving problems, looking at ways of stress management. That could be as simple as, exercising, eating right, getting good sleep. All of those basic components that we need to have in place to keep us on that steady state. And again, that resiliency is promoting those positive behaviors as we're moving forward. But even though we might have the best resilience in there, sometimes we can't manage it on our own. It's normal to feel fear after a traumatic occurrence, but with time, the fear typically lessens. It does take some time. In patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, the memory doesn't ever diminish. You're just seeing how you can influence the thoughts or how you reacted to that memory is usually the intentions of it. Your thoughts, how your emotions to that occurrence, and how you can move forward on a day-to-day basis. That's the goal to moving in that direction. To move that way sometimes can't be done individually, and you do need support. Talk to your primary care doctor about that, whether it's about you or your family's health. If you have a loved one who is also has gone through a traumatic event, talk to them how you can help support this individual through there. There is also opportunities to talk to a therapist. There is a number of therapeutic components, therapy sessions. Sometimes medication is indicated to help individuals cope through their trauma and getting them on that steady state. Every person's journey for wellness is different. So do not feel that, what may have worked for somebody else will 100% work for you. There is always opportunities to find ways of helping, and that's why it's important to talk to your doctor, talk to your therapist, your treating provider, to figuring out what's the right approach and works for you and your loved ones. If you are in crisis, or there's anything become so overwhelming, unfortunately, individuals sometimes think that it's easier to harm themselves, or they will think about attempting suicide. Let you know that those thoughts can become overwhelming, but there are people who want to help. There's help available. There is calling 911 in an emergency situation. And in July, we are in the United States, which is just about a couple weeks away at this point, are switching to a suicide hotline. So it's an extended specific number, 3-digit number, 988, that can be utilized to help individuals who have thoughts of hurting themselves or in such a crisis where they feel so overwhelmed that they think the only next recourse is not to live. But they are there, people who are here to help. They are there to provide free resources available 24/7, 7 days a week. All the calls are confidential. It is professionals who are on the line who are here willing and wanting to talk to you to help you get to that right connection. If also for crisis situations, we have other national and local resources. For our Florida Blue members, we do have our partner, New Directions, who can offer resources for national or local services. We also have provider information that can be shared. There's educational information, whether it's in NINI or NAMI, so the National Institute of Mental Health or the National Alliance on Mental Health. Both are great resources that have articles, information that talks about signs and symptoms and treatment that may be available from not only PTSD, but other topic points such as anxiety, schizophrenia, working with children, with kids. All of those are indicated in there. If there's also some needs from other resources or local resources, United Way is a great partner that we have or we have been using before. And again, it's a 3-digit number. So 211 is one to contact them, and they provide everything, not just for maybe groups that might be available in your area or support systems, but they also help with other things such as food, housing, employment, anywhere in the United States. So if there's need of help, those resources are out there. So we want to thank everybody for this time and being able to present to the collective group. We are very excited to be able to do this. We're going to open up the questions. As we were indicated in the beginning, we are definitely here and excited to being able to have these conversations, being able to share this information. We like sharing information from a knowledge perspective so people are aware, know what needs to happen as they are working with individuals out there. But one of the components is that we definitely, if you have questions that's more individualized, or if you're talking about your own treatment modalities, that's definitely conversations we would love for you to have with your individual treating provider or doctor. So you guys, again, can have something that's more unique and personalized from that perspective. Since this conversation and this topic may be sensitive, we also want to be mindful of those who are asking questions. And there may be a few that we might make some, if they're indicated in the chat, there may be some triggering to other individuals. So we are going to have some discretion when we are answering some of the questions, just to be mindful of those who may be having components here. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kim and Debbie. And the first question that came in, and I don't know if the person who asked this might give us a little bit more detail, but someone asked, what is complex PTSD?
I'll defer to you, Debbie.
Yeah, I think what that's referencing is more the catastrophic. So again, there is post-traumatic stress disorder. If there was a one-time occurrence, say that there was a car accident, that event may have been a traumatic event that occurred that has caused now that individual to potentially not want to drive or not go down a certain road, and that causes that traumatic impact. A more complex post-traumatic stress disorder may be a repetitive occurrence that happened, abuse, domestic violence. There is a number of individuals who are military soldiers who have come back, have been going through because they have seen something time and time again that has caused it more instead of it just a one-time occurrence.
Okay. What's the best way to locate a therapist for talk therapy?
I think the best approach is, if based on your insurance company or coverage that you have, looking at the type of providers that are available in your area. There are a number of resources that you can see either a provider face-to-face. A number will also can provide telehealth, which is a video conference. So it would be a conversation like this. I look at it more like as you are interviewing somebody for a position, you're interviewing this person to meet your personality and your approach. So if there are certain things that you have of high value, if it's a certain race, is it the therapist be a certain sex, things along those lines that are important to you could help you select who that right provider is going to be. There are a number of different therapeutic providers out there. There are licensed clinical social workers, licensed mental health counselors, pastoral care. If you are faith-based and would like to have somebody who is also supporting that as part of the therapeutic approach, psychologists as well can have conversations, or just a few. So there is some individuality of what type of provider you would like to go see, but all of them, sometimes it's a location that you may make a decision. Do you want somebody close by, or if you want to do telehealth, that can kind of help it as well to connect with somebody quickly.
Okay. If you feel you have PTSD, how do you go about getting a diagnosis? Not COVID related, but from a past trauma.
There are actually even measurements. Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I was just going to say that brings up a really good point that I don't think we pointed out, that just because a trauma happens, like PTSD can happen at any time. So it doesn't have to, these symptoms don't have to develop like right after it's happened. So I just want to point out that even though your trauma was a long time ago, you still could have PTSD. And you'll obviously want to work that out with your provider, but I'll let Debbie, she's the expert in the more treatment aspect of it. So I'll defer to you on that.
Yeah, and there are certain standardized tests that a therapist, provider can actually go through a series of questions that talks about a range of certain normal indicators that flag that you do have a post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's usually a Likert scale or questions that they have. There are certain providers, you can talk to your primary care doctor about that, and they are aware of some of those triggers. As a more in-depth indicator, there are providers who have experience, again, who specialize in post-traumatic stress disorders, knows the common questions, can guide very safely those conversations, because, again, it could be very overwhelming, and they're there to help support through that.
Okay. Like trauma changes the brain's wiring, can cognitive behavioral therapy also do the same to reverse what was done by the trauma?
Yes.
Cognitive, yeah, okay.
Sorry, I went for a really simple answer, but you go.
No, please. Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy is a thought change process. So again, kind of how you're changing your thoughts, kind of change. I'll let Kim talk about the actual brain. She's better about those questions.
So yes, thank you for asking that question. And that's what's so important to understand about mental health and just therapy and even medication, is that it can actually help treat it, and sometimes you can actually recover from these things. So yes, therapy does help kind of work that rewiring, because it helps you better understand like your triggers. It helps you better handle stress and stuff like that. And then over time, those things kind of backpedal, and that's how your symptoms get better. But I will say sometimes people with PTSD, they have lifelong symptoms, but really the goal is to get you to a point where it's not greatly impacting your quality of life. But excellent question.
Okay. I've seen information about New Directions Behavioral Health. I've also been getting information from Teladoc on mental health. Which one should I go to first for counseling?
Teladoc does have therapists within their organization, and then New Directions would be, again, identifying providers that they have. So they both can provide the services. You do not need both of them, but whichever one is a better fit. If New Directions can help with that telehealth provider, or if you're looking for face-to-face, if that's a preference, they can help assist with locating that provider close by you that you could see from a face-to-face office setting.
Okay. Can losing a loved one be a trigger for PTSD?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Simple answer, yes.
Okay.
Anything, I'll go a little bit more on that. Anything that makes a person feel threatened or scared can be categorized as a trauma. Like, trauma is very specific person to person. So just because maybe someone else doesn't think it was traumatic doesn't mean it can't be traumatic to you. So I think that's something that it's important to understand, that if you and your friend were in a situation and it really impacted you, but maybe didn't impact them, it doesn't mean that you're weak. It's just that your bodies interpret stressful, traumatic responses differently. But yes, to answer your question, losing a loved one can especially trigger that. So.
Okay. Generally speaking, how has, or can social media impact our mental health?
Oh, My personal opinion, I think what you feed, not only your heart and your stomach, the food that you put in, it's also the stuff that you hear on a day-to-day basis. So the things that you're surrounding yourself from social media, news, if it's positive stories, I think a lot of people feel more positive. But if it's a gloom and doom perspective, again, a lot of times we begin to spiral through that is what we think is only around there. And that's hard to dig back out. So I think that they could have some impact on there. I know personally I have kind of turned off the news from watching it on TV. I collect it from different ways in short little bites so I don't have to become overwhelmed because they can become almost absorbed into that kind of world.
Okay. Next question. I'm a mom, and my son, who's 40, lives with me, talks incessantly about his girl relationships, analyzing why they do what they do. He has a lot of the same complaints day after day. He won't seek counseling, but he says he needs it. He procrastinates about many things. What can I do to help me cope with listening to this? He can talk for hours and doesn't have any male friends.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, obviously, it's your child. You want to be nothing but warm and caring for him, and that's never going to stop. For you, it is that balance because, again, if you're hearing all of this negativity all the time, it becomes very overwhelming. A recommendation could be if your son wants to go and talk to a counselor, it could be together saying, hey, this is a lot that's going on with you. Why don't we go in together to talk to somebody to figure out how to work through this, how to figure out how to overcome these concerns. If he doesn't have any male friends, is there ways of social networking or opportunities that they can have to help balance so it's not all heavy on your own individual shoulders?
All right. So the next question is, do you recommend EMDR? And you said that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy.
It's for post-traumatic stress disorder, there's been a lot of literature that has support using that as a way to work through trauma. So I have heard great things. I know in the veteran population that I have worked with, there was a number of our soldiers that had used EMDR to work through the combat stress and trauma that they were going through. So I've heard great success with it.
Okay. I've found it pretty difficult to find resources to assist children with coping with the pandemic and the emotional effects that it has on them. Our pediatrician has not been any very helpful. Do you have any suggestions?
I know our kids have definitely gone through a lot. They're, depending on the age and the information and components that they've seen, the little ones may not even understand what was happening. The older ones, being removed from their social group that they've had for such a long time, it's hard to understand why, and they were kept away, and there's been a lot of literature. I don't know resources right off the top of my head, but I looked online for some components, and there is, some support groups if they are going through stress still at this time, talking to them about that. If it's looking for a social connection, maybe they are still not able to interact with friends, trying to find ways to do that, I think is important to continue that connectivity that they have with individuals. Kim, do you have any thoughts or recommendations?
I was just going to say some of those websites that we had at the end of the presentation on here, I would go to some of those like NAMI and stuff like that because I've seen tons of, I don't have kids myself, but I've seen a bunch of resources on there because I was sending them for my niece and nephew. There's stuff on there, and I guarantee those other websites also have it. So,
okay. Do I have to find a local therapist?
So I'm assuming that question is, do you have to with telehealth, there is that kind of flexibility that you could see somebody in the state of Florida if you are living in Florida. For insurance coverage, that's usually kind of where it is linked based on where you are living. For if you want the insurance to pay for that therapist has to at least be in the state that your coverage is provided. The connectivity or who you are able to interact with really depends on you. With telehealth, there is that, like I said, better flexibility to, if you live in Jacksonville, being able to talk to a provider down in Miami.
Okay. So this is an interesting thing. Since mental illness can be debilitating, but it's an invisible type of disability, do you know if there's some kind of an ID card that someone diagnosed with a mood disorder could present to others? So let's say someone who has anxiety or bipolar disorder and strangers don't understand why the person might be having an episode or some darkness and they can't communicate at that moment. Would there be any kind of card they can present? That way they wouldn't get arrested or restrained unnecessarily.
I don't think there's a government type ID card, if that's what was being kind of underlining of those questions. I have seen, like, for an autistic child or for individuals who may be other illness that a family has made said card, if they can't communicate, that it could be simply just showing somebody kind of what was going on with that individual so that if they're not able to verbalize it. If somebody is going through regarding about arrest or restraint unnecessarily, that usually is tied to the police department, and what I have seen or those interactions is normally that if the person is at risk of hurting somebody else, they do have to look at the safety of those around. They try to be as gentle as they can. They try to be as sympathetic as possible. But if there is concern of safety, they will, look at, what they need to do to protect the other community members.
Okay. What might be available for those who are unemployed and don't have insurance but need counseling?
Yeah, there's a number of different, especially with United Way. I know that there are some agencies that have free services or sliding scale capability that are indicated out there from different community resource options, so that is available.
And if you're a veteran, I would encourage you to look into vet centers, and obviously the VA too, but vet centers are free if you're a veteran.
Mm-hmm. And depending on faith,
yeah,
at certain churches, talking to your pastor or to a priest could be an option as well.
Okay. Is an enlarged amygdala a permanent condition?
So
that one's yours.
Here we go. I love the brain. So the graphic that I had, I'm such a nerd. The graphic that I had, it can be permanent. The longer this goes untreated, the more likely it is to not change. That doesn't mean that if you have waited to get treatment for a really long time that things can't get better, but it can be the longer you go without symptoms or the longer you go without treatment of your symptoms. And that's why really with any mental health disorder, especially if you can get in earlier, the better, because you're more likely to have better outcomes long term, because just like PTSD changes your kind of chemical makeup and brain matter, the other mental illnesses also do the same thing. So just keep that in mind too.
Okay. We are at 2:00, so we're out of time. So thank you so much, Debbie and Kim, for spending this time with us. We have a short 4-question survey. If those of you who are participating could either point your smartphone at the QR code or click on the link there. We've got a couple of handouts, and we've got some upcoming webinars. I will put all of this information into a follow-up email for all of you, and we will see you in a few months. We've got one in September with the behavioral health team on suicide awareness and prevention that is open not only to members but to the community. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank